Konnichiwa. Today we're going to look at self-move and other move words. If you look in a standard Japanese textbook or dictionary, you will usually see these defined as transitive and intransitive verbs. Now, this isn't as far off as some of the things you find in these books, such as conjugation, which doesn't exist in Japanese, passive, there is no passive in Japanese. Transitivity and intransitivity does exist in Japanese, and most of the time there is a big overlap between that and self-move and other move verbs. However, it doesn't work all the time, and it isn't exactly what is meant by self-move and other move in Japanese. So, if you're familiar and comfortable with the Western term transitive and intransitive, it doesn't hurt a lot if you use them, at least not most of the time. But if you're not familiar with them, don't try to learn them just for the sake of Japanese, because they're not really accurate. So what are self-move and other move words? In Japanese, a move word, doshi, is a verb, a word that denotes an action or a movement. So a self-move word is a verb that moves itself. So if I stand up, that's a self-move action. I'm not moving something else, I'm moving myself. If I throw a ball, that's another move action. I'm not throwing myself, I'm throwing the ball. And really, it's as simple as that. Now, Japanese has a lot of pairs of words, so we could say that they're either two forms of the same word or two very closely related words, where we have a self-move and an other move version. So one very good example is deru and dasu. They both use the same kanji, which means come out. The base form is deru, and that means simply come out or emerge, and that's the self-move version. The other move version is dasu, and that means take out or bring out, cause something to come out. So in the first case, whatever it is moving itself, it's coming out, it's emerging. In the second case, the actor of the sentence, the actor of the verb, is bringing something else out or taking something else out. Now, this is often very useful because in many cases it gives us two distinct words that are easy to understand because they're closely related. For example, makeru means lose. Doesn't mean lose an object or lose money, but lose a contest, lose a war, lose a battle, lose a game. Be defeated, in other words. Now, makasu, which is the other move version of makeru, means defeat. In other words, cause someone else to lose. So, where we have two words in English, lose and defeat, in Japanese we have fundamentally the same word in its self-move and its other move versions. So that's very useful, but not so useful if you don't understand how to form self-move and other move versions of a word. If you look in the standard textbooks, most of the time they're going to tell you that you just have to learn all the self-move and all the other move words separately. Sometimes they give you lists of self-move and other move pairs, transitivity pairs, as they call them. But this isn't true and it isn't necessary. Most of the time we can tell which is a self-move word and which is an other move word. There are a few very simple rules that cover most of the move word pairs. And those rules are even easier if you understand the logic that underlies them. And that's what we're going to learn right now. The first thing to know is that there is, as it were, an Adam and Eve of self-move and other move words, the mother and father of them all. And these are aru and suru. Aru is the mother of all self-move words. It simply means be. So it's a completely inward-directed verb. You can't be or exist something else. You can only be and exist in yourself. It's fundamentally and absolutely inward-directed. self-directed. Suru, on the other hand, means do. So they mean be and do. And suru in itself, just doing, can never exist on its own. You have to be doing something. So this is the father of all other move verbs. Now, why do we need to know that? Why is it important to know that? Because when we know that, it unlocks most of the move word pairs that we're going to encounter. How does it do that? Well, there are what I call 3 laws of move verb pairs. And the first of those laws is that if one of a pair ends in su, that is going to be the other move word, always. Why? Because that su is related to suru. So in the example we gave before, deru, dasu. Deru means come out, and dasu, which ends in su, is the other move verb. That's the one that means take something else out. In makeru, makasu, we know that the other move verb, the verb that means make someone else lose, is makasu, because it ends in su. And an awful lot of those su pairs actually make that particular transformation, eru to su. But not always. In some cases we have, for example, ojiru, which means fall, and otosu, which means drop. They have the same kanji, they are a pair. They don't have that regular eru to su ending, but otosu still has su on the end, so we still know that that is the other move partner of the pair. Now, the second rule is that where one of a pair ends in any of the a stem plus ru, so it ends in the sound aru, that is going to be the self-move partner of the pair. Why? Because that aru is related to aru, the mother of all self-move verbs. The usual pattern here is eru to aru. We already looked at that in the last lesson, where we have agaru, which means rise up, get up, and ageru, which means raise something up. It's very often used to mean to give something upward to another person. So we have agaru and ageru, and we know that the self-move partner of the pair is agaru because it ends in aru. The usual form here is eru to aru, but again it doesn't have to be. There are other cases such as kurumu, which means wrap, and kurumaru, which means be wrapped. But again it doesn't matter because we know that the one ending in aru is always going to be the self-move partner of the pair. Now the third law is that if we take any regular verb ending in u sound, as they all do, and change it to the ero and add ru, which means that it ends in eru, that flips a self-move word to another move word or another move word to a self-move word. The problem is that we don't in every case know from the structure which way the word will be flipped. However, this is not as difficult as it seems, because first of all, this is not a large number of verbs. The majority are covered by the first 2 rules, and of this group of u to eru flips, the majority is mu to meru. And meru is, I would call this, an honorary member of the su family. Or you can say that mu to meru is the honorary 4th law. Whichever way you put it, in mu to meru, meru is always the other move partner of the pair. And indeed, as you get more experienced in Japanese, you will get to feel that meru ending verbs have a suru-like other move feeling to them. And this really is all you need to know if you're beginning with self-move or other move verbs, because this covers really the vast majority of all the pairs you're going to encounter. So don't feel that you have to learn the rest of this lesson. You can come back to it later whenever you want to. But I'm going to just complete it partly so that you have all the information you might need for the future, and partly because it's going to give us more insight into how self-move and other move really works. So the next thing to know is that as well as Meru, which is the big one, there are also other honorary members of the Su family, and these are Bu to Beru. Beru is always the other move version, and Bu and M are very close in Japanese. You may know Sabishi, Samishi, and other words like that where you can just use Bu or Mu in the same word. So Meru and Beru naturally are both honorary members of the Su family, and also Tsu Teru. The Teru is always the other move pair. So, in the end, we really have very few wild cards in this pack. The only ones that we really can't tell which way they are going is Ku and Gu to Keru and Geru, U to Eru, and those Ru ending verbs that don't fit either of the first two laws. So these are, in fact, the only exceptions where you really can't tell structurally which way they are going. So is there anything we can actually do about this last small minority of self-move, other-move flips? And the answer to that is yes, but it's a little bit subtler, and it will become easier as you become more competent in Japanese. So you don't need to worry about this if you're at an early stage. The rules I've given you cover most of the cases. But when we take a verb that structurally you can't tell which way it's flipping, a lot of the time we can tell semantically. That's to say that when I say that the ero plus ru flips transitivity, I mean exactly that. The ero version is the flipped version. The u version is the original, the one that's in the basic form of the verb. So to take an example, uru means sell. It's a very common word. There's a less common version of it, which is ureru, and that's the flipped version. Now, selling is obviously an other move verb. I sell something. I can't just sell in the abstract. I sell something or other, and so I'm moving that other thing, quite literally. But ureru means sell in the other sense, as in that game is selling like hot cakes. So in this case, we are talking about a book selling or a game selling. So the thing that is doing the selling here is also the thing that is moving. So this is a self-move version, isn't it? So it's clear that uru is basically an other move verb, but when it's flipped, it has a self-move version. Now, if we take one that goes the other way, shitagau means obey or follow. And it has a flipped version, shitagaeru, which means to be followed by or obeyed by. Now it's clear here that the basic idea is obeying or following, and that the extended idea is being obeyed or being followed. So here it's clear that the other move version is going to be the eru version, because that's the flipped version of the basic concept to obey or follow. And we can also note here, for those of you who've been asking yourselves, why does she say that transitive and intransitive aren't correct? This is an example. The Japanese English dictionaries tell us that shitagau is the intransitive version. But if you think about it, shitagau means obey or follow. This is not an intransitive word. You can't just obey or follow in the abstract. You obey someone or you follow someone. It's a transitive verb. So why do the dictionaries call it intransitive? Because they have made the commitment to translating self-move as intransitive. But while it's a transitive verb, you obey someone, you follow someone, it is also a self-move verb. In obeying someone or following someone, you are not moving that other person. You are moving yourself. In being obeyed or being followed, you are not moving yourself, you are moving that other person. So this is one of the cases where self-move and other move do not correspond to transitive and intransitive. There aren't too many of those cases, so it doesn't matter if you want to use transitive and intransitive. Just be aware that the meaning is not exactly the same in any case, and in some cases it doesn't fit at all. Now, as I say, if you just want to remember the 3 rules and nothing else, that is going to break the back of self-move and other move verbs for you. In most cases, you can understand them with nothing but that. So the rest of what I've told you is very useful as you become more proficient at Japanese. But if you just remember the concepts of self-move and other move and the 3 basic rules, the Aru version is always self-move. The Su and Seru versions are always other move. And if you also remember that the Meru version is also other move, that's worth throwing in because that covers a lot. And with those, you really have the problem of self-move and other move verbs mostly under control. If you have any questions or comments, please ask them in the comments below and I will answer. And I'd like to thank my Gold Kokeshi patrons, my producer angels, who make these videos possible. And I'd like to thank all my patrons and supporters on Patreon and elsewhere. My Red Kokeshi patrons are credited in the information section below. And I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. Korekara mo yoroshiku onegai shimasu. Class dismissed.